Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
The party was full of people scattered around a huge suburban mansion. 20 and 30-year-olds dressed in elaborate outfits meant to look stylish without any obvious intention of impressing. They played pool or ping pong, watched TV, ate, drank, danced, and laughed, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. In the corner of the main room stood a tall, thin man with dark, curly hair and a handsome, open face who nervously glanced over his shoulder at an aggressive, tipsy red-haired woman who was clearly hinting that she was ready for any entertainment at the party or afterward. However, the man nodded absent-mindedly, obviously trying to extricate himself from a conversation that, at another time, he might have started. The last few words of her vague question pierced his consciousness, and he realized he needed to answer. "So, this is a date?" He cast a slightly frightened glance at the redhead. Yes, of course. Shall we go in your car?" "I probably shouldn't lead," he added, looking around the room over her shoulder again. "Listen, I don't mean to be rude, but I really need to find Jason. Could you, text me or something, and we can decide what we'll do later?" Surprise flashed across the redhead's face. "Jason? Jason Bright? Did he come to the party? I thought he became a monk or something." "Yeah, I talked him into coming, and now I can't find him, so I need to—" At that moment, a pretty blonde with curly hair walked past, and the man suddenly rushed toward her. Hey, Cara." The blonde turned, and her face lit up with a wide smile. She looked at the beer bottles in his hands and raised her eyebrows in anticipation. "Hey, Brian, did you bring one of these beers for me?" He looked at her with slight confusion, as if he didn't understand what she had said, and then suddenly blurted out his own question. "Hey, where's Jason? I want to get some beer and haven't seen him since." The blonde's smile faded, and she nodded toward the next room. "He was in the entertainment room about 15 minutes ago. Maybe it's worth checking there." She smiled again. "Why? Is he your boyfriend or something?" Brian gave her a serious look and laughed briefly. "You'd probably want that, wouldn't you, Cara? But no luck. The thing is, I barely convinced him to go out and have fun, so I'm a little worried about him having a good time." He turned to the redhead, who seemed slightly annoyed that her dominance over Brian had been overtaken by the beautiful blonde. "Listen, really, text me what you want to do. I need to find Jason, okay?" The redhead pouted and nodded with muted enthusiasm. "Okay, I'll find you after." But Brian was already gone before she could finish, making his way determinedly through the crowd toward the entertainment room. There, he found a dozen people lounging on the couch, sitting cross-legged on the floor, or hanging out while a music video played on the huge TV. He looked around and then noticed a cheerful, fat man who was staggering and dancing to the music, holding a glass in one hand and palms full of potato chips in the other. "Hey, bud, have you seen Jason?" "Jason?" "Yeah, Jason Bright. He was here a few minutes ago." "Oh yeah, man, I'm pretty sure he left. He suddenly got up and walked around like he was throwing up or something. He left from the room." "No, man, right through the front door." Brian stood still, slowly shaking his head, trying to comprehend the fat man's words. "What? Why? What the hell happened?" "I don't know, man." When the game ended, we switched the channel to some movie and watched it for a minute, and then he suddenly left. "Movie? What movie?" "Oh, the old one with Dustin Hoffman, The Graduate." But we almost didn't watch it because we just turned it on at the very end. "At the end?" "Yeah, that scene at the wedding where Hoffman breaks in and knocks on the glass, and the girl runs away with him." Brian's face began to turn red, starting with a slight shade of pink and quickly turning bright red like a tomato with human features. Then slowly, he began to throw words at the fat man, carefully enunciating them with increasing force and volume for maximum effect. "You played a movie where a bride leaves her groom for another man at the damn altar with Jason Bright walking out of his apartment for the first time in months? You're a bigger idiot than I could have imagined." Jason Bright lay on his side, enjoying the sight of his sleeping bride. She breathed softly and rhythmically, each exhaled breath slightly blowing a strand of straw blonde hair that fell across her face. To most people, Penny Miller was a small, attractive woman, maybe with a few extra pounds and features that were just a little too rugged to be considered classically beautiful. But here, as the morning light fell on her fair, clear skin, giving it a kind of luminous transparency, she seemed to Jason to be an absolute angel, a gift of love from God himself. By general standards, Jason had been incredibly successful in life up to this point. He excelled in school, both in sports and academics, graduating with honors, and then achieved near-perfect grades in a double major in finance and statistics before earning a master's degree in economics from the Chicago Business School. After that, he easily got a job at one of the best trading firms in Chicago and steadily climbed the career ladder with increasing responsibility and earnings. However, he never felt like life was going the way he wanted until he met Penny. And that was because, despite all the success in business and sports, he never had anything resembling a satisfying romantic relationship. At school, he had been a nervous teenager around girls, too nervous and completely unsure of how to approach them, let alone have a relationship. He gained some confidence in college when a few active girls saw him as a good match and didn't let his insecurities get in the way, but it all led to a series of superficial relationships that, with or without intim, had no significant meaning for Jason. This pattern continued through business school and into his new job for a couple of years. But then he met Penny, and everything changed. It was easy to be with her. She was cheerful, sociable, and attractive without any pretensions. She wanted quiet, relaxing evenings, a house with a white picket fence, and children, and Jason wanted her. So, with a sense of comfortable inevitability, their relationship smoothly developed and strengthened from casual dates to passionate nights where they made love more and more often, which eventually became so practical that they had to move in together. Then, on a warm summer evening in a small lakeside park, Jason got down on one knee and with trembling hands offered Penny a ring, which she accepted with tears, a smile, and a tight hug. In the 8 months since all the necessary arrangements had been made, invitations had been sent, dresses had been chosen, and a church had been booked in Penny's hometown in southern Illinois for a date that was only 6 days away. Jason smiled at the memory and leaned down to kiss Penny softly on the cheek. Her eyes fluttered, and she yawned, then smiled lazily, letting out a pleased sound and arching her back, throwing off the blanket. "Hey, baby," she said in a half-whisper, smiling at him and running her hand along his bare thigh. "Did you sleep well?" He nodded and was about to answer, but suddenly stopped, reacting to her soft caresses, and could only exhale in response. Jason carefully approached Penny, hugging her and kissed her. His kisses trailed down. She responded to his caresses by snuggling closer to him, their breathing becoming a little faster. He gently ran his hand along her back, feeling her warmth and their desire to be closer to each other. Penny rolled over onto her back, inviting him to her, and he looked lovingly at her face, filled with tenderness and trust. She whispered softly, asking him not to stop, and Jason nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. Their rhythm gradually accelerated, but it was a deep emotional connection that connected them. At that moment, as the tension between them reached its peak, they felt relieved and calm at the same time. Penny sighed softly, her face glowing with peace, and Jason, clinging to her, felt complete satisfaction. It was a moment full of love and mutual understanding. They lay next to each other for several minutes, their arms, legs, and bodies still intertwined, silent, their faces so close that their noses touched, and they could feel each other's breath. Jason felt completely content and at peace, and was just about to fall asleep when he felt Penny gently rocking his shoulder. Hey, Jason, don't fall asleep again, baby. We still have a lot to do." Opening his eyes, he smiled at Penny and gently stroked her face for a moment, then sat up, shaking his head slightly to clear his thoughts. "What do we have left, Pen? I thought we were almost done." "Not much, just some last-minute packing and a couple of errands. But I want to start early." "Okay. Are you ready for your big trip to Centerville? Ready to meet all my family and old friends?" Jason smiled again. "I'm ready to do anything just to be with you." "Correct answer." She purred, stretching lazily like a contented cat, and then wrapped her arms around his neck. They made good progress along I-55, listening to music and talking. Penny occasionally texted friends or family to update them on their progress towards Centerville or to make some final arrangements for the wedding. About half an hour before their arrival, she became quieter, and Jason noticed her looking thoughtfully at the landscape passing by. After a couple of minutes of silence, he decided to break the pause. "Are you okay, honey? Problems with catering or something else?" She looked at him with a slight expression of embarrassed surprise, as if she had been caught doing something illegal. Oh, no, I was just thinking about coming home and all the ghosts and problems I left behind," Penny said. Jason looked at her with slight bewilderment. "Ghosts? Problems? What are you talking about?" Penny sighed sadly and looked absently out the window for a moment before answering. Well, there's nothing serious, Jason, but some of my old friends and family had a certain idea of who I should be with, and they wouldn't really support the wedding and all that. Wait, are you saying that your parents don't like me? I thought we got along great when they visited us both times. I thought I had a great time with your dad. Did I get it all wrong? Penny shook her head vigorously. Oh, no, not at all. My parents really like you. They think you're wonderful. Jason raised an eyebrow. Is that true? She bit her lip for a moment, as if wondering what to say next, but then continued. But like I said, some old friends and family. Well, they still think. Penny paused, looking out the window again, a look of uncertainty appearing on her face. Listen, Penny, what exactly are you trying to say? You seem to think I should figure it out myself, but I really don't have the slightest idea what you're talking about. Penny sighed heavily. Listen, Jason, it's about Kenny. Jason glanced at her briefly, then turned his eyes back to the road. What's wrong with him? I mean, everything ended between you two about 5 years ago, right? Why is this a problem now? Unless, of course, you've told me something I don't know. Penny shook her head, then paradoxically nodded, her face showing a mixture of concern, confusion, and irritation. No, well, yes, in a way. Look, Jason, I told you everything that was important. We were pretty serious with each other in school. We were going to get married, but then it just didn't work out. Penny paused again, biting her lip. The uncertainty returned to her face. Jason shrugged and raised his eyebrows, waiting for her to continue. Well, the thing is, some of my friends seem to have invested too much in our relationship. They considered, and still consider, it's some kind of romantic fairy tale, and they constantly persuade me to give Kenny another chance. They say he's changed, that we're made for each other, and all that nonsense. Jason pursed his lips, pondering what he had heard. He involuntarily pressed the gas pedal, quickly overtaking a car in the right lane. So, what are you trying to tell me? That I have to compete with your ex a week before our wedding? Is that what you mean? Penny clenched her fists in irritation and pressed them to her eyes. No, not that. I'm not trying to say that, she said. She removed her hands from her face and looked at Jason pleadingly, waiting until he took his eyes off the road for a moment to look at her before speaking again. It's just, some of them, a couple of friends, Teresa especially, might try to, set Kenny and me up or be mean to you or something like that. I just want you to be ready. That's all. Teresa? She's one of your bridesmaids, isn't she? You asked the man who doesn't want us to get married to be in the wedding procession? Isn't that a little weird? Penny grimaced. Yes, I understand what you mean, but Teresa was and still is my best friend, and I feel, obligated to invite her. I was her maid of honor, and it would have been rude, I guess, not to include her in my ceremony. She looked at Jason with an expression asking for understanding, but he just looked at her silently, then turned back to the road. After several minutes of silence, he finally sighed heavily, turned to Penny, and put on as reassuring a smile as he, Listen, Penny, I'm in this for the long haul. If someone wants to make our life difficult, I will survive it, as long as you're on my side, as long as we both support each other. What could go wrong? After all, it's really just you and me, and no one can hurt us, right? So stop worrying. I'll be on my best behavior, be charming when I have to, and bite my tongue if I have to. I'll make sure everyone in Centerville knows you made the right choice. And if it doesn't work out, so what? In the long run, their opinion means nothing. All the nervousness disappeared from Penny's face, and with a contented smile, she snuggled into Jason's shoulder as he continued to drive. It was nearly dark when they arrived at Penny's childhood home, a 2-story farmhouse on the outskirts of Centerville, in a quiet neighborhood with large, fenceless yards and tall, old maple and oak trees. They had only gone a few steps down the path when Penny's mother, a plump, short woman with graying hair pulled back into a bun and a pleasant face, burst out of the house, squealing loudly with joy. She opened her arms, approaching her daughter like a hesitant middle-aged woman, then said, "Oh, Penny, how is my beautiful daughter doing? My bride," she exclaimed, hugging her with soft arms and enveloping her in a sweet cloud of perfume. Kissing her on the cheek, she held Penny in her arms for several long seconds, enjoying the moment before reluctantly letting go and turning her attention to her future son-in-law. "How are you, Jason? How nice to see you. You look so good, so handsome," she said, hugging him for a moment and leading them down the path to the door. "Come in. Dad is waiting inside, and dinner is almost ready. We have so much to discuss." Dad was Penny's father, a quiet, serious man who stood up from the couch as they entered the house to hug his daughter and firmly shake Jason's hand. As Mom walked into the kitchen to start serving food, Jason and Penny made small talk. After a few minutes, he led them to the table, and with a sense of domestic authority, showed them where to sit, said a short prayer over the food, and nodded his head toward the dishes, which included pork chops, salad, and a large bowl full of mashed potatoes. Dinner for 4, which would be enough for 10 people. The first conversations at dinner were almost exclusively about the wedding, with the women enthusiastically discussing seating arrangements, final preparations for dresses, photo shoots, music repertoire, and the reception menu. When Penny mentioned making sure everyone was in place during the actual ceremony, Penny's mom's face suddenly took on an expression of pain and surprise, as if she had just remembered an unpleasant detail that needed to be addressed. She turned to Jason. "Jason, honey, when is your dad coming?" "What day?" Jason put his fork down, swallowing a mouthful of mashed potatoes. "I think he has a flight to St. Louis on Thursday afternoon, so he'll be here that evening for the rehearsal dinner." Mom's face suddenly darkened, and she looked as if she were about to cry. Her voice trembled with deep regret. Oh, Jason, I'm so sorry. I was afraid this would happen. Oh, no, oh, God." Her words became quieter and quieter until they turned into a pitiful whisper and died out completely. Jason looked at Penny for some clue on how to react, but she just shrugged. Then he turned back to Penny's mom, trying to catch her eye, frowning with sympathy and concern. "Look, I don't think it's a big problem. I'm sure everything will be fine. Just tell me what's wrong." The older woman shook her head and covered her mouth with her hand, hiding the trembling of her chin, which always happened when she was on the verge of tears. She took a few deep breaths to calm herself before answering Jason. "Well, last week I was informed that there was an error and the country club wouldn't be available on Thursday, so I told them we could move the rehearsal dinner to Wednesday. Clarice also found it convenient and made a few calls to change the parties to Thursday." Jason laughed in relief, realizing that the problem was minor. He reached across the table to pat her arm, try to calm her down. "It's not a problem at all. My dad doesn't really like big events, to be honest, so this will be even better for him. And I'm sure the photographer and stewards will show him where to stand and sit on Saturday. Everything will be fine." Penny's mom took a deep breath and let out a quiet sigh of relief. "Are you sure, Jason? I don't want anyone to feel abandoned." "Oh, I'm absolutely sure. Everything will be fine." He gave her the most reassuring smile he could muster. "But what exactly are the parties you mean on Thursday?" "I don't remember any party." She smiled again. "Well, of course, the bachelor and bachelorette parties. Isn't your witness Brian, right? Wasn't he planning a bachelor party?" "Oh yeah, I guess. I told him not to do anything big, though. I don't like drinking, to be honest, and I don't want any big send-off. Most of my friends are only coming for the wedding on Saturday, so I didn't even think of it as a bachelor party, just a little get-together." Jason rubbed his chin and looked first at Penny, then at her mom. "I hadn't really thought about it, but does that mean Penny is having a bachelorette party?" Mom beamed even brighter. "Oh yes, of course. Teresa is organizing everything, and she is delighted. I think you're going to have so much fun. Becky will come with Bob, Susie with her husband, and of course Teresa with Tim. And as I understand it, there are many others. Your old friends from school want to see you." Jason smiled at her enthusiasm and casually glanced at Penny. She sat as if frozen in place, her face resembling a motionless mask with a forced smile, clearly trying to hide the fact that the news about the party was causing her discomfort. Jason felt an uneasy feeling inside. The rehearsal dinner had just begun, and Jason was already ready to leave. Over the past 2 days, he had felt like he was on display in front of Penny's friends, not much different from her new ring, an object of admiring glances, exclamations of admiration, and at times almost imperceptible glances of disapproval or even envy. This dinner promised even more of the same. The main problem was Teresa Southern, a tall, attractive woman with a somewhat regal and commanding posture, sitting directly across from the table with her rather tipsy husband, Tim, a stocky man with slicked back hair and thick sideburns. Teresa, who had been the head cheerleader in high school and had somehow managed to maintain her leadership role 10 years later, was Penny's self-proclaimed best friend and seemed to command the dinner conversation like a judge at a talent show, deciding what topics were appropriate and what jokes were funny. Jason first met Teresa the day after he arrived in Centerville, and from then on, she became a constant source of irritation. She subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, manipulated the wedding plans, receptions, and entertainment, inviting or excluding friends from one event after another, and pushing Penny to agree with her ideas about how things should be done. But the most annoying and disturbing presence was Kenny, the former high school football star, Prom King, and Penny's ex-boyfriend, whom Teresa had somehow put on the agenda. He sat at the table, smiling, nodding his head, and laughing at every story that came up during dinner, all of which involved Penny in it. This had become almost unbearable for Jason, so he slowly chewed the chicken while listening to another story told in an excited, almost hysterical tone by the little brown-haired, mousy-faced girl sitting next to Teresa, whom Penny had known since school. Another flashback story concerned, as it turned out, the next chapter of their long-standing epic relationship with Kenny. This time, it was about Kenny ordering a horse and carriage to transport Penny to the prom. Penny was blushing, and Kenny was beaming, as Jason felt a growing nausea that threatened to send the rubber chicken back onto his plate. Oh, and Penny was in that vintage Colleen dress, remember? She was simply magnificent, spinning on the dance floor like a whirlwind, as if she had just stepped off the set of Gone with the Wind. She paused for a moment, catching her breath, swallowing nervously, and looking around, obviously trying to make sure everyone liked the story, before continuing in an even higher-pitched voice. And Kenny was in an old black tailcoat with a top hat and was dancing a waltz or something like that. After they were announced king and queen of the prom, Teresa nodded toward Penny and gestured with her fork, smiling fondly. "No one ever looked more beautiful or happier than you did that evening, darling," she said, looking back at Penny and Kenny, her gaze fixed on each of them in turn. "You two were absolutely amazing." Enthusiastic cries of approval from the other women immediately rang out around the table. Penny smiled nervously, blushing, and Kenny beamed. This time, he had nothing to add to the noisy chatter in which everyone remembered their dance at that same prom. As the table became animated, Jason became lost in thought, desperately trying to distract himself from what was happening so he could maintain some composure. He looked around, noticing Penny's parents at another table, and wished they were sitting with him instead of her school friends. He studied the decorations for a moment, wondering why Penny had chosen green and yellow when her favorite color had always been royal blue, until he remembered that those were the Centerville school colors, chosen by Teresa. Finally, he returned to the faces at his table and suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness, as if he were a stranger at his own party. Sorry, they probably got a little carried away. He barely heard a voice above the noise and his inner flight from the conversation. Jason turned to his right to see who was speaking and found a plump, freckled woman with brown curly hair, narrowed eyes, and a slightly crooked smile. "What? What did you say?" he asked. She nodded towards Teresa. "Sorry if she took over a little. It's just that she knows everyone here so well, and they're all so close. I don't think she's deliberately trying to keep you away from everything." Some of the tension inside Jason dissolved, and he was able to smile. "Yes, I understand. I think everything is clear to me. It's just a little hard to engage in conversation when I don't know all the stories, and probably I have something completely different in my head right now." The brown-haired woman continued to smile. "Like the wedding, for example." Jason chuckled, laughing slightly. "Yeah, kind of like that. Well, my name is Betsy. Betsy Palmer. I don't know if you remember." Jason interrupted. Yeah, we met yesterday at the mall. I remember." They chatted casually for a few more minutes until Jason suddenly heard his name mentioned in a questioned voice from the other end of the table. He looked around in bewilderment and realized that Teresa was addressing him. "Sorry, Teresa, what did you say? I didn't hear." Teresa smiled discreetly. "Jason, I asked." She emphasized the word asked with some irritation at having to repeat herself. "Could you tell us what you do?" Penny thought you'd explain it better. Feeling the blood rush to his face from the sudden attention, Jason began to stutter as he tried to explain. "Well, I create and analyze economic models using the latest analytical techniques to help our firm make investment and marketing recommendations for the clients." Everyone stared at him for a moment, not understanding a word. "Well, it's all as clear as mud," Kenny laughed. Jason looked at Penny, who smiled and nodded, encouraging him to continue. He smiled back, still confused, and tried to explain again. Actually, it's not that difficult. I'm essentially testing the market, mathematically speaking, to help our clients, companies, and investment institutions decide what to do with their products or whether to issue shares. Something like that. This explanation drew a few appreciative smiles and nods, but the atmosphere around the table became decidedly quieter, and Jason felt an urgent need to fill the air. He took a deep breath, put on his best fake smile, and turned to Kenny with an expression of interest. Kenny seemed a little surprised that Jason had asked him a question. "So, Kenny," Penny said, "you work at the Ford dealership we passed on our way into town. Do you like your job?" Is it a good place? Kenny raised his eyebrows, expressing suspicion, and answered in a tone that was unusually calm and quiet for him, choosing his words carefully. Yes, this is a good job. I think. Yes. Sometimes you have to work late, but I like it. You're in the sales department, right? Do you sell cars? Kenny's tone suddenly changed sharply, and his answer sounded harsh, with a hint of anger and irritation. No, not a salesman. He emphasized the word no through clenched teeth. I'm a manager. I do more than just sell cars. Much more. There was an awkward, painful pause, and Jason felt the weight of all the eyes in the room on him, aware that he had apparently made a terrible social mistake, but not understanding exactly what it was or how to correct it. Sorry, I didn't mean anything by it. I'm sorry. He embarrassedly squeezed out an apology, raising his hands in a gesture of reconciliation and smiling faintly. A feeling of relief came when Kenny smiled back weakly and muttered, "It's no big deal." They were huddled together in the narrow bed in the room where Penny had spent her childhood. Moonlight rushed in through the open window, casting faint, ghostly shadows. Penny and Jason lay in each other's arms, discussing the evening's events, analyzing the rehearsal dinner. They both agreed that it was not at all what they expected. Too much food, too many people, too much noise, and most importantly, too much stress. What was his reaction when I asked if he sold cars? Jason asked. He literally exploded. I wanted to fall through the ground, and I think I wasn't the only one. Penny pursed her lips, looking thoughtfully at the ceiling, wondering what to say. Kenny carries a certain weight, Jason. You need to understand this. His reaction is not entirely his fault. Jason turned on his side and looked closely at Penny, his brow furrowed in concern and irritation. He interrupted her in a cold, businesslike tone, devoid of the previous warmth, which expressed his dissatisfaction and disappointment. Wait, are you saying it's my fault? I just don't see what I did that was so terrible. Seriously, I didn't know he was that sensitive. I didn't mean to embarrass him or create a scene. I just wanted to somehow keep the conversation going by asking a completely harmless question. Penny half smiled and rolled over to lie facing Jason, her hand reaching up to gently caress his cheek as she searched for an answer. Oh, Jason, it's not your fault, honey. You just have to understand Kenny. Understand his insecurities. Come on, Penny, we all have insecurities, but we learn to live with them. You can't explode every time someone says something that offends you. He didn't blow up that much. Penny began to answer, but Jason raised his eyebrows in confusion and was about to interrupt her when she changed tactics. Listen, hey, race the thing. Kenny has always been the king of the hill, the best athlete, the most popular guy in general. That's all. But after school, it all ended. He didn't get the football scholarship he was hoping for, which meant he didn't go to college, didn't get his dream job, and didn't get the girl he wanted. Jason interjected with obvious implication. And the girl he wanted? Penny agreed, smiling and leaning down to kiss Jason, her hand gently stroking his face as if to calm him down. Don't be mad at my friends, please. Jason wrinkled his nose slightly and cracked a weak smile. I'm not mad, really. It just seems, I don't know, like you still have some kind of connection with Kenny. Sometimes I feel like I should. Penny raised her eyebrows in surprise. You a what? I don't know. Like I have to fight for you or something. It drives me crazy, I think. Penny's expression became puzzled, and she opened her mouth in surprise before answering. Oh, come on. You don't have to fight for me. I'm yours, you know that. Where did you get this from? Jason pursed his lips and frowned before hesitantly, a little embarrassed, he answered. I don't know. I think when Kenny came over with that girl last night, and again today, it seemed like he was trying to make you jealous. And from your reaction, it seemed to me that it worked, that you were upset because he was paying attention to someone else. I know you were pretty serious, but I think that at least for Kenny, his feelings haven't quite gone away. Penny pursed her lips tightly, deep in thought, and was silent for a long time before she began to speak slowly, carefully choosing each word. Listen, Jason, you know Kenny and I have been together for a long time, right? From the first year of school until a couple of years after graduation. Jason nodded. Yes, you told me that. Well, I told you we were going to get married, and it's true. We even had ideas for a honeymoon and everything. But after I graduated, the relationship became a little tense. Kenny didn't really want to work in an office, but I wanted to go to college and get a trade. We argued a little about this, but in the end, I went to study and he stayed here. We were still dating. I came over on weekends and spent holidays with him, but he started to get jealous. Jason shrugged, acknowledging the feeling, a familiar one. Penny smiled and continued, so he started coming to campus and showing up unexpectedly in different places. He said he wanted to surprise me, but in reality, he was testing me. I even caught him watching me a few times. It all came to a head one evening in the library. I was in a study group discussing an essay with one guy, and he put his hand on mine, probably flirting, but nothing serious. Then Kenny appeared. He was standing behind the shelves of books, and suddenly he comes out and tells this guy to stay away from me. I was so ashamed, and Kenny and I had a huge fight right there in the library. I finally took the ring off and threw it at him and told him to leave me alone and not bother me anymore. Wow, you haven't told me this before. Was this final? Is it over then? Well, we talked on the phone a couple of times and met a few times, but it wasn't the same. I moved on, met you, and here we are. She wrapped her arms around Jason's neck and pulled him close, pressing her lips to his ear and whispering, "Now it's just you and me, okay? Kenny is just an old friend." "Okay, honey," Jason said, smiling and kissing her neck. He lay on his back while Penny used his chest as a pillow. After a few minutes, he felt her breathing become rhythmic as she fell asleep. He continued to lie there, staring at the ceiling. John Raymond Bry was a robust-looking man with a leathery square face and gray hair cut short in a severe crew cut. He sat between his son and Jason's best man, Brian, who, a handsome, muscular man with curly hair and a winning, sly smile, at the only bar in Centerville that served food. It was a sports bar with rock music playing loudly, making conversation difficult. John ran a massive hand over the stubble on his head as Jason recounted the week's events, including Kenny's outburst during the rehearsal dinner. "God, what an idiot," John said in a loud, hoarse, blunt voice as he reached for his beer. "He looks like a complete idiot." Brian laughed in agreement and took a bite of his hamburger. Jason just shrugged. "Maybe, but in general, Dad, you didn't miss anything. I think you find it all pretty boring." "Yeah, maybe," John said, munching on a French fry. "Anyway, I would probably only disgrace you, so maybe it's for the best." Jason started to object, but John stopped him with a raised hand. "It's okay, Jace. We both know that this," he waved his hand broadly, indicating the scene in the bar, "is the best I can do." Jason took a sip of beer, rolled it around in his mouth, and then swallowed. "Yes, well, that's quite normal too, Dad. Better than last night anyway." John Bry looked at his son carefully and then pointed back to the bar. "Is this all you wanted for your bachelor party? A couple of hours at a sports bar with a burger and that smiling idiot with his old man. No girls, no dancing." Jason quickly shook his head. "No, Dad, everything is fine, honestly. Even if I wanted girls, this is a small town. Rumors would spread instantly. I don't want to start my marriage off badly." "Yes, I understand," John nodded, taking a bite of his burger. "Understand." The three men spent another hour at the bar, talking, joking, drinking beer, and watching a football game on the big screen behind the bar. Eventually, the conversation petered out, and they decided it was time to go their separate ways. In the parking lot, Jason waved goodbye to Brian, then got behind the wheel of his car as his father climbed into the passenger seat with a muffled groan. Both men seemed lost in thought as Jason drove the car down the highway toward the hotel where John was staying. No one spoke. Both looked at the road, their faces indifferent, like those of people who didn't really see anything. After a few minutes, John began to fidget. He opened his mouth several times, cleared his throat, and looked at Jason, indicating that he wanted to say something but didn't speak. Finally, a couple of miles before the hotel, John broke the silence. "The big day is Saturday, son. Big day. Are you ready?" Jason glanced at his father and turned back to the road. "I'm ready, Dad. Really ready. In fact, I can't wait to get married. I want to be a husband, a father." "Well, you'll be great, son." "Excellent." John turned away from his son, and his voice became quieter, acquiring an awkward, almost inaudible tone. Definitely much better than I was." Jason quickly looked back at his father. "Dad, stop it." "No, son. It's true," John said, raising his hand to stop him. "We both know I was a lousy father. We both know it. Damn it. Your mother and I separated when you were, how old? 3? And I barely saw you until—" John paused for a moment, turning away and taking a deep breath a couple of times. "No, you got a hard lot, son. It's a tough lot. When Mom got into that accident and you were stuck with me," his voice trailed off into silence. In the darkness, Jason noticed his father bring his right hand to his eyes to wipe something, then clear his throat and swallow several times before continuing. "So, I'm happy for you, son. Damn glad you have this girl you love. Glad I can see this." Jason nodded as the car pulled into the hotel parking lot, then turned to his father. "Dad, I'm glad you're here. Honestly, you are my family. I couldn't do this without you." John Bry turned to his son, and for the first time in his life, Jason saw tears on his father's cheeks. He heard his hoarse voice waver as he spoke. "Look, son, I just want you to know how sorry I am that you had to stay with a scoundrel like me when your mother died. Damn it, Jason, I could barely take care of myself, let alone raise an 11-year-old boy." John stopped to wipe away the tears, but they were already streaming down his face, and his voice became higher and more uneven until he finished his thought. I want you to know how much I loved being around you, even if it didn't seem like it at first. How I loved watching you play in those matches, how you went to school. God, you were such a hard worker with those part-time jobs and still managed to get excellent grades, all those awards, and a college scholarship. And then you worked like hell again and got this high-paying job. I just want you to know that you deserve to marry such a wonderful girl, and that I'm so damn proud of you, son. Damn proud. Now Jason was crying too, and both men sat in silence, each with their right hand on the other's left shoulder, looking at each other without the slightest sense of awkwardness. Finally, John opened the door and walked across the dimly lit parking lot to his room. Teresa Jones and her parents owned perhaps the largest home in Centerville, a huge Georgian mansion set on several acres of land, with half a dozen bedrooms, a game room, a library, and a huge living room. That night, the living room was filled with a dozen young women who lay on sofas or sat cross-legged on the floor, giggling and telling stories, drinking wine, and screaming with delight and embarrassment as the hero of the occasion opened her gifts. Penny, being the bride and the center of attention, smiled as wide and laughed as loud as everyone else, surrounded by a pile of gag gifts and lingerie. She was in her element and felt at ease and at home among her old friends. But the moment one of her drunken friends asked her to try on one of the lingerie items, it turned into a chorus of demands that were echoed by all the women. Penny, blushing to the roots of her hair and vigorously shaking her head, did everything she could to dissuade them, until she realized that they would not back down. Hesitating in embarrassment, she took the offered lingerie and walked down the corridor to the only bedroom on the first floor. She laid out the outfits on the bed, tapped her cheek with a finger, trying to decide what would be the least humiliating thing to wear, and finally chose a baby doll with a sheer cape, the most modest option possible. She took her time putting it on, looked at herself from every angle in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, and then walked back down the hallway to the waiting women. They greeted her return with loud screams and whistles, the kind usually heard in nightclubs. Penny laughed nervously, and although she felt awkward, she tried to play her role correctly, posing as seductively as she could for her hot friends. Most of the women responded with laughter and applause, but Teresa, who was quite drunk, began screaming for Penny to show her something else. "Give me another one, Penny! Show us something else!" Unsurprisingly, the other women supported her, but this time Penny firmly refused, vigorously shaking her head and trying to decline as politely as possible. When she finally retreated back down the hallway to the bedroom, the girls groaned in disappointment. A moment after Penny returned to the bedroom, there was a knock on the door, and Teresa's cheerful squeal announced the arrival of 3 men who had brought champagne and vodka as a gift to appease the hostess for intruding on the party. Without much protest, Teresa led them into the room. The first 2, Dill Jenkins, a short and plump man with an angelic face and horn-rimmed glasses, and Tom Anders, a taller, thinner version of Bill, but with even less facial hair, retreated to a corner of the room to hang out with their girlfriends. The third man was Kenny Bailey, who immediately asked Teresa where Penny was, quietly explaining that he had brought a gift for her and wanted to give it to her before the wedding. When Teresa told him that Penny was changing in the bedroom and would be out soon, Kenny immediately began organizing everyone into a makeshift choir to sing the school anthem when Penny returned. However, in the bedroom, Penny heard extra noise from the arrival of the men and assumed it was just the women playing a new game or telling another dirty joke. Her return to the living room was delayed by the fact that she kept thinking she was being too boring. She began to wonder whether she should give in to the girls and show them more revealing lingerie. She finally decided to have fun and comply with their request. So, after taking a sip of wine for courage, she took off the baby doll and put on a super pretty black corset with red trim, matching panties, and fishnet stockings. She looked at herself in the mirror one more time, practiced a few poses, took another sip of wine, and then, as confidently as she could, left the bedroom and headed down the corridor to the waiting women. She burst into the room with a giggle, posing seductively with her hands on her hips and shaking her breasts in front of the crowd, which somehow ended up lined up in 2 rows, back to back, like a choir. The only thing she noticed to her first disappointment was the complete lack of reaction from the audience. The women simply stood there with surprised or even shocked expressions on their faces, silent, some only opening and closing their mouths, and several of them making almost panic gestures towards something or someone at the edge of the room. And this someone turned out to be 3 men. Bill and Tom stood there with their mouths open, Bill's drink slipping from his hand and smashing on the floor, while Tom nervously wiped the sweat from his brow. However, Kenny grinned widely and began clapping slowly and rhythmically in recognition. Penny screamed loudly, instinctively covering her breasts with her right hand and her panties with her left. She screamed again before turning around and running back to the bedroom. She lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, frozen in shame for a good half hour before Teresa came in to gently persuade her to return to the party. When Penny reappeared in the living room, there were only a few girls left sitting at the coffee table, drinking the last of their wine and talking quietly. Kenny was still there, reclining on the couch with his usual sly grin on his face. He waved to her, and she reluctantly came over, making her way through the furniture and gifts, groaning as she sat down next to him, covering her eyes with her hands, her elbows resting on her knees. God, it was so humiliating, she said. I can't believe this happened. I will never forget this, no matter how long I live. Kenny laughed, patted her on the back, and leaned over to whisper, if it's any consolation, he'll never forget it either. Honestly, I regret that I didn't have a camera to capture this moment for posterity, and in case one day I'm lonely and horny. Penny removed her hands from her face and glanced at Kenny, giving him a brief look of genuine disgust. But his smirk turned into an outright grin, and she, to her surprise, laughed and leaned back on the couch. Well, I didn't expect anything else from you, she said with faint indignation, playfully hitting him on the shoulder. Seriously, someone could have warned me you were coming to the party. I was simply shocked. Kenny responded with an indifferent shrug and a laugh, then gestured broadly to Penny and the remaining girls. Surprise is my secret weapon. Without it, I would have missed so many interesting things. She, Kenny, and the rest of the group continued to tell jokes and frank stories for about an hour before the conversation grew quieter and more thoughtful. Finally, Penny yawned, stretched, and announced that she was starting to fall asleep and it was time for her to go home. Teresa, swaying slightly, began to look for her keys, but Kenny, laughing, stopped her, insisting that he would take Penny home, to which she agreed enthusiastically. Teresa smiled and nodded, then fell awkwardly back onto the couch, watching with approval as they walked away together. The conversation on the way home was light and casual, full of observations about the romantic habits of their old friends, discussions of the marriages of acquaintances, and memories of past days and events. 2 blocks from Penny's house, Kenny pulled off the road and parked next to a tall hedge that screened the car from the windows of nearby houses. What are we doing here? Penny asked, suspicion in her voice. I have something for you, Kenny replied, unbuckling his seatbelt and turning toward her, moving closer. Penny raised her hand to stop him, shaking her head vigorously. No, Kenny, no. I'm getting married in 2 days, and I'm not going to sit here in the car with you and make out for old time's sake. It's just not. She stopped abruptly when she noticed Kenny handing her a small wooden box with slightly rusty hinges, offering it as a gift. Well, what is this? She asked. Open it, Kenny said softly but insistently. Penny slowly opened the box and held her breath in surprise as she looked at its contents in the dim light of the car. Wait, it can't be, she muttered, trembling as she took an opal pendant on a thin gold chain from the box. Surprise and delight reflected on her face. How did you find it? I tried to find it many times by diving, but I couldn't, so I drained the pond and carefully combed through the mud until I found it, Kenny said, his voice soft. Remember 2 years ago, in the summer? Penny clumsily began to undo the clasp, trying not to damage the thin metal with her shaking fingers. When she finally managed to open it, she stretched the chain in front of her, lovingly admiring it in the dim light. Why did you wait so long? Her voice sounded detached, like the voice of a little girl who had just seen a miracle for the first time. I had this crazy thought that we could see each other again, and maybe get back together. That's why I kept it to myself. I kept it in case such a moment suddenly came. Kenny bit his lip and moved a little closer to Penny, his cheek almost touching hers. But, well, you got engaged, and that put an end to all those plans, so I thought I should give it to you now before the wedding. Penny picked up the chain and tried to fasten it, but her fingers were shaking. Kenny leaned closer, his cheek almost touching hers, and took the clasp. "Give it here," he said, fastening it and carefully placing the chain on the back of her neck with a light pat. "That's it," he whispered, his lips so close to her ear that Penny could feel his breath. "Thank you." Penny breathed heavily, clutching the pendant in her right hand, as if it were life itself. "I love you," Kenny said simply, kissing her neck. Tenderly, an electric current ran through her body. She froze, unable to hug him or stop him, as Kenny continued to kiss her neck, shoulder, and then her jawline. He moved closer to her lips, stopping just an inch away, their breaths mingling. "I love you," he repeated, and when Penny closed her eyes and parted her lips slightly, he pressed his lips to hers. Now she was already answering, her lips and tongue moving along with his. Her arms slid around him, pressing his body closer to hers. The kisses grew more passionate, and his hands slid down to her thigh and then under her skirt until they touched her panties. When he touched her, Penny felt the shock of pleasure. She pulled away sharply, her hands resting on his shoulders, horror, pain, and regret freezing on her face. I can't do this," she whispered. Kenny removed his hand from her hip, placing it on her waist, and with his other hand, he gently held her shoulder. "It's okay, Penny, it's okay." She shook her head furiously, moving away from him and pressing herself against the car door. No, that's not okay. I'm getting married, Kenny. I'm getting married in 2 days, and I can't do this." She opened the door clumsily, freeing herself from her seatbelt, and essentially fell out of the car, hitting the ground with a thud. Rising quickly, she still shook her head and ran toward her house, disappearing into the darkness. 12 hours later, Penny stood on a small bench in the middle of the living room, motionless and silent, like a living statue wrapped in a flowing snow-white wedding dress. Her mother fussed around her, adjusting her sleeves, smoothing out the folds of the fabric, making sure everything fit perfectly. "You don't talk much today, honey. Is everything okay?" Penny sighed heavily. "Yes, Mom, everything is fine." Mrs. Miller gave her daughter a long, doubtful look. "You don't look very good. Is everything okay with Jason?" Penny looked down sharply, a look of sudden panic appearing on her face. "Of course he's fine. Why? Why should he be upset? Did he say something to you? Seemed angry?" "No, dear, nothing like that. It's just that you were so quiet that I thought maybe you two had an argument or something. I thought maybe he was upset that Dad and I insisted he sleep somewhere else the night before the wedding. Perhaps this is too much, and perhaps it shouldn't have been so demanding, but for us, it's important. If this is a problem for you, then he can stay here. He doesn't have to leave." Penny exhaled a long, relaxed breath and absent-mindedly stroked the opal pendant on her neck. "No, Mom, he's okay with it." "Yes, he would agree to sleep separately for a whole week if that was what you wanted. Jason is a good guy. He's respectful." Mrs. Miller continued to fiddle with the dress, casting searching glances at her daughter. "What do you have there?" she asked, nodding at Penny's neck. "What?" Penny asked with a guilty tone, abruptly letting go of the pendant as if it had suddenly become hot. "This chain with a stone? I've never seen it before, but now you wear it like it's some kind of treasure. Did Jason give it to you?" Penny pursed her lips, hesitating to answer. Kenny gave this to me." Mrs. Miller suddenly stopped fiddling with the dress and took a step back, placing her hands on her hips in a gesture of displeasure. "You accept gifts from ex-boyfriends? A woman who's getting married tomorrow?" Her voice sounded stern, accusing, and Penny, crossing her arms over her chest, answered her mother with the same gesture, but with a decisive, serious expression on her face. "This is different, Mom," she said, touching the pendant. "This is the pendant Kenny gave me for my 16th birthday. The one you dropped overboard on a canoe trip today after he gave it to you? The same one I thought was lost forever?" Mrs. Miller replied. Penny smiled, a distant look in her eyes as she gently twirled the pendant in her fingers. "He found it for me. He drained the pond and found it. He returned it to me yesterday, Mom. I think it's a wonderful gesture, isn't it?" Mrs. Miller snorted. "I think it's a gift from an ex-boyfriend who's still in love with you. That's what I think, and I think you should be damn careful around this guy. Penny, very careful. He's seductive, this boy. A real seducer. and you're marrying a good man tomorrow. Don't bring old feelings into your marriage, honey. It's dangerous. Don't do this." Penny frowned and answered with irritation in a sharp, slightly tired tone. "Why don't you like Kenny so much, Mom? You were always negative toward him, as if he was never a good match for me. Everyone around him adores him, except you. Why is this?" Mrs. Miller took a step toward her daughter and gently took her hand in both of hers, looking in her eyes with love and care. "Oh, honey, I'm good to Kenny. I like him, and I would be happy if you were with him, if that's what you really wanted. All I want is your happiness, honey. And if your happiness was with Kenny, that would be good. But I always worried about him. I was worried that he didn't have the same goals in life as you. He's seductive, like I said, a guy who can create a romantic atmosphere for one night or for a moment. But he has no ambition to build a comfortable life for his family every day." Penny's frown deepened. "That's why they got married, Mom, so that he can make your life comfortable. Is this the reason you married Dad?" Mrs. Miller smiled. "No, honey, I married your father because I love him, and he loves me. But one of the reasons I love him is because he takes care of me every day, works for me, and gives me the life I want. If Kenny was what you wanted, if you wanted a life with him, that would be normal, absolutely normal. But I have to say I'm glad you have Jason. He is a good man and will take care of you. He will make you happy for many years." Penny nodded and shrugged. "I know that, Mom. He's a wonderful person, and I love him. It's just, I still have feelings for Kenny, and being here with him makes everything complicated. I understand it's difficult to completely bury a past relationship." Mrs. Miller looked at Penny with understanding and concern. "I understand, darling. I really do. But you need to concentrate. Collect your thoughts. Tomorrow you are getting married. You are marrying a wonderful young man who deserves the best. Remember this." Penny vaguely agreed, nodding slightly while thoughtfully stroking the pendant. That evening, as Penny lay in bed for over an hour, staring wide-eyed at the shadows cast by the dim moonlight, she heard music for the first time. At first, it was so quiet that Penny could not understand where it was coming from, but gradually, it intensified. The girl suddenly realized that the music was coming from outside, under her window. She carefully got out of bed and walked to the window, where she saw a small group of musicians, 2 guitarists, a bassist, and a clarinetist, performing a not very successful, sometimes out-of-tune version of Elvis' hit, "I Can't Help Falling in Love with You." She half expected some kind of wedding prank from her friends and opened the window with a smile, intending to drive the musicians away. But as soon as she leaned out the window, her gaze caught on something to the right. She turned and, in the dim light, saw the figure of Kenny sitting cross-legged on the roof above the porch, next to the window. He smiled widely and began to sing the words of the song along with the musicians. Penny stood frozen in place, unable to move or say anything, listening with her mouth open to Kenny's hoarse voice and his discordant musical declaration of love. When she heard her father call her through the bedroom door, "Penny, what's that noise? Is something going on there?" Penny moved away from the window and shouted toward the door. "No, Dad, it's just a prank. Some guy's playing music on the lawn." "Well, damn it, it's already midnight. Just a minute, they'll go out and drive them away." The thought that her father might see Kenny on the roof made her panic. She poked her head out the window and hissed at Kenny. "Hide." "Where?" he asked, spreading his hands in a gesture of bewilderment, not seeing any suitable hiding place, and realizing that Kenny would only be able to get down to the lawn through a rather difficult path, which would give her father time to open the front door. Penny clenched her teeth and whispered quickly, "Get in here." Kenny gladly took advantage of the invitation and, smiling, quickly climbed through the window, quietly closing it behind him. He then turned to Penny. "Hello, Penny. It's unexpected to meet you here," he said with a cheerful look. She tried to keep a serious, displeased, irritated expression on her face, but his phrase completely disarmed her, and Penny laughed, sitting down on the bed and shaking her head. "God, Kenny, you're always getting me into trouble." Kenny leaned back casually next to her, still smiling, with his hands behind his head and his back resting against the headboard. "With such an angelic face, you can get out of any trouble, baby. Absolutely anyone." "What a liar you are, Kenny." "Oh no, I wouldn't lie to you about that, baby. You know I'm serious." He nodded and raised his eyebrows to emphasize his words. Then his eyes fell on the pendant Penny was still wearing, and he pointed to it. "You wear this opal?" Penny took it in her hand, glancing at it briefly before looking back up at Kenny. Yes, I wear it. It's a very sweet gesture, a wonderful thing from a friend." "Kenny, thank you. Thank you very much." Kenny moved closer to her, lifting himself off the headboard and raising his hand to touch her cheek. Is that all between us, Penny? Are we just friends? Because, honestly, I feel more for you. What I said yesterday, I meant it. Penny raised her hand to his, which was gently touching her cheek. Her eyes peered into his, as if she was looking for an answer. Any answer to the question of how she should feel about a man sitting with her on the bed just hours before her wedding. There were no words, but the expression on her face, full of longing and affection, was enough for Kenny. He moved closer until his lips touched hers. I love you, Penny, he whispered in a hoarse voice. I love you too, she replied before their lips met again in a long, deep, and passionate kiss. Their arms slid, and they pressed their bodies, immersed in the embrace. It didn't take long before he loosened his grip and stood in front of Penny, who remained sitting on the bed. He took off his shirt, then his jeans and underwear, and stood there without anything for a moment, his body glistening slightly with a light sweat. He walked over to her and reached for the hem of her nightgown, pulling it up over her hips and buttocks, gathering it at her waist. She lazily raised her arms above her head in agreement as he pulled off her nightgown and tossed it aside before gently pushing her back onto the bed. Kenny was partially pressed against Penny, his right arm wrapped around her neck and his thigh between her legs. He leaned toward her and kissed her gently, starting with her lips and then slowly moving to her neck and shoulders. Penny responded to his touch, rising toward him, and their movements gradually synchronized. He carefully ran his hand along her body, feeling the warmth and the tension growing. Kenny carefully removed her underwear and stood at the foot of the bed, continuing to kiss her. He started with light touches on her legs, gradually moving upward until their eyes met again. They watched each other's reactions, feeling the depth of the moment. As he slowly moved even closer to her, a special intimacy formed between them. Soon, their bodies moved in the same rhythm. Penny wrapped her legs around his lower back. Their movements were coordinated but quiet, as if they were trying to keep the moment to themselves without breaking eye contact. They exchanged silent glances full of understanding and affection. He slowly rolled off of her and picked her up, whispering, I love you, one more time before she laid her head on his chest, and they fell asleep together. When Penny woke up, she was greeted by Kenny, softly snoring on his side, and the sound of her mother's voice coming from the doorway. Penny, honey, you better get up, sweetie. It's already late. In a sudden panic, Penny hit Kenny on the shoulder several times to wake him up and then quickly covered his mouth as he began to speak. She pointed frantically at the bedroom door in her mother's voice. Penny, did you hear me? Yes, Mom, I'll be out in a minute, she called out, trying to stay calm. Sweetheart, I have your dress. Let me bring it and put it on your bed so you can wear it whenever you're ready. Wait, Mom. Penny practically screamed as she jumped out of bed and headed for the door, grabbing her nightgown and wrapping it around her torso. Don't come in. I have really bad gas, I think. Her mother's voice took on a mocking tone as she began to open the door. What? Oh, don't make me laugh. I'll just come in, put the dress on your bed. And no, Mom, Penny shouted, slamming her shoulder against the door to keep it from opening all the way. She then came face to face with her puzzled mother, who was still standing in the hallway, her path to the bedroom blocked by her clearly worried daughter, who seemed to be muttering something incoherently. Seriously, Mom, it's really bad in here. Really bad. I can barely stand it myself. And, well, it's so awkward, you know? And I'll be downstairs in a minute to put on the dress there. Throughout her rambling monologue, Penny kept looking back at Kenny, who was quietly running around the room, picking up his shirt and underwear, but apparently not finding his pants. Penny angrily motioned for him to go, and Kenny eventually opened the window and practically dived through it, jumping off the roof onto the lawn below and running away from the house and surrounding area, wearing only his boxer shorts. During the conversation, Penny managed to maintain her composure by constantly referring to the toxic atmosphere she had created in her bedroom, essentially forcing her mother to stay in the hallway until she was sure Kenny was safely out of the room. At that moment, the tone of her voice changed, and she abruptly opened the door, inviting her mother to enter. Okay, Mom, if you insist, you can come in, but I warned you. She quickly walked across the room to close the window and, noticing Kenny's pants near the dressing table, secretly kicked them under the bed. Meanwhile, her completely confused mother slowly crept into the room, sniffing the air carefully before allowing herself to take a deep breath. Penny, I don't know what you're talking about. It smells good in here. Penny smiled nervously at her mother, Is it true? I think it smells terrible. It must be the excitement before the wedding. Yes, yes, I suppose so, her mother said in a slightly worried tone. Penny sat in a hard, upholstered, straight-back chair in the preparation room right next to the chapel. Her immaculate wedding dress flowed around her in white waves. Her hair was styled in dainty, romantic curls, and her hands were folded in her lap as she stared mindlessly out the window. At that moment, she heard the door open, followed by the sound of quiet footsteps on the carpet. Please, please, I want to be alone for a few minutes, Penny said without checking who had entered. Then she heard her mother's voice, soft, gentle, loving, and kind. It's me, Penny. Mrs. Miller sat quietly on the chair opposite her, looking carefully at her daughter with an expression of pain and sympathy on her face. In her hands, she held Kenny's neatly folded jeans and his wallet. Penny, darling, she said, picking up the jeans. I found this under your bed. Do you want to talk about this? Penny stared at them in shock for a moment, then burst into tears. Oh God, Mom, what should I do now? I don't know what to do. Mrs. Miller placed the jeans on the floor, pulled her chair closer, and took both of her daughter's hands, looking intently into her face as she spoke. Penny, honey, what do you want? Who do you need? Because that's all that matters. It's hard for me to say what I want, Penny whispered, her voice shaky. I feel like I'm at war with myself. Mom, when I'm with Jason, everything feels right. Everything about him is just perfect. But Kenny has my heart captive, and I can't let him go. Penny bit her lip, her worried expression darkening even more as fresh tears traced new paths down her painted face. Oh, Mom, it would just kill Jason. How will I do this? Mrs. Miller wiped a tear from Penny's cheek, looking at her daughter with love and concern. Well, honey, I don't know exactly what to say, but I'm sure you can. And no matter what happens, you know that you will always have my support, my love, and my blessing. If it's important, Jason, Brian stood in the groom's room, barely containing his excitement, as he carefully adjusted Jason's tuxedo, brushing off lint and straightening his tie, making sure the groom looked absolutely flawless. As Brian straightened the tie, Mrs. Miller and Penny entered the room. Jason's face lit up with a wide, joyful smile, which immediately turned into a look of concern when he saw Penny's pained expression, emphasized by bloodshot eyes and traces of tears. Penny, what's wrong, honey? Are you okay? He walked away from Brian and took 2 steps toward Penny, intending to hug her, but she stopped him with a raised hand. Jason, we need to talk, she said simply. Mrs. Miller motioned for Brian to come out with her. Of course, honey. Certainly. Tell me what happened. Penny shook her head slightly and turned away from Jason, tears forming in her eyes again. Without looking at him, she began to speak again, quietly and uncertainly, her voice filled with pain and regret. Jason, I have bad news. Very bad news, and I don't know exactly how. Sweetie, whatever it is, everything will be okay, Jason started to say, taking a step forward. But again, Penny raised her hand and looked him straight in the eyes, never taking her gaze off him. Please, Jason, let me finish. Because it really won't be okay. Penny swallowed hard twice, turned away, then looked back at Jason before starting again. Jason, I can't marry you. I'm sorry. I love you, and I know you love me, but I just can't do it. The emotion in her voice disappeared, becoming almost mechanical, as if this was the only way she could say these words without bursting into tears. Jason shook his head and tried to force a smile, which probably should have calmed him down, but it only made everything more painful, revealing the fear and vulnerability hidden behind it. Penny, honey, if you're nervous, I understand. We can put this aside. We can take our time. And Penny was already shaking her head furiously, hot tears rolling down her face, which had an expression of determination. No, Jason, no. I can't marry you now. I can never marry you. It would be a mistake for both of us. I can't be your wife, Jason. I just can't. I'm sorry. Jason spread his arms in a helpless gesture and took another step forward. But Penny, he began, but she just sobbed, took off her wedding ring, and handed it back to Jason with a trembling hand. After that, breathing heavily as if choking on pain, she sharply turned away from him, almost tripping over her dress, and ran out of the room. John Bry was standing in the church foyer, just outside the chapel, when the commotion began. He saw Penny's mother come out of one of the preparation rooms with Brian Hewitt. They were talking tensely, and Mrs. Miller's face was somber, Nothing like what John expected from the mother of the bride on her daughter's wedding day. As they were talking, several women came closer and began to eavesdrop on their conversation. When the essence of the conversation became clear, the women hastily dispersed throughout the church, creating a chain reaction of gossip. In less than a few minutes, men and women were already whispering excitedly, discussing what was happening, tugging at the sleeves of any passerby to exchange a new portion of rumors. By this time, Brian's conversation with Mrs. Miller had almost ended, and it had apparently turned unpleasant. Brian's face was flushed, his nostrils flared as he made some final remark before abruptly turning around and heading back to the groom's room. John took a few quick steps toward him. "Hey, Brian, what's going on?" Brian looked at John and shook his head in disgust. "Everything's canceled," he said dryly. "There will be no wedding." "What? This can't be," John replied, walking next to Brian towards the preparation room. But any doubt that Brian might be wrong disappeared as soon as he saw his son, barely able to stand, leaving the room with a look of deep pain on his face. His tuxedo was disheveled, his once perfectly coiffed hair now a messy heap, and his eyes were full of tears. Oh God, son, what happened?" John asked, his voice filled with shock. Jason could only look at his father and shake his head, completely devastated by the news his ex-fiancée had just given him. At that moment, Kenny Bailey burst into the church, wearing only suit trousers and an untucked white shirt, no jacket or tie. He immediately addressed the first woman in an oversized dress. "Where is she?" The woman nodded enthusiastically toward the arch leading into the reception hall, and Kenny immediately headed in that direction. John watched with narrowed eyes, then looked at Brian, who wore the same expression of disgust. He looked back at Jason, still in a state of shock, then back to the arch through which Kenny had disappeared. John's face turned red, and he began to clench and unclench his fists. He walked toward the reception hall, weaving his way through the crowd until he was inside. There, among a crowd of people chatting and laughing, Kenny knelt in front of Penny, who, still in her wedding dress, sat on a straight-back chair, nodding happily through dried tears. Kenny held her hands and spoke to her with a wide, encouraging smile. Shaking with uncontrollable rage, John took a long, angry look at the couple and exploded. "What the hell is going on here?" His words made the whole crowd pay attention to him. Everyone looked at John in surprise and condemnation, but their disapproval didn't bother him. "Are you saying that my son's heart was broken because of this loser?" He pointed at Kenny with an incredulous look on his face. Penny began to cry again, and Kenny responded by gritting his teeth and standing up as Penny's father made his way through the crowd toward John. "Listen, I'm asking all of you who seem to be enjoying this spectacle so much while my son is in grief. I'm asking you if it's true that this..." Before John could finish, Penny's father punched him, hitting the corner of his mouth and causing John to take a step back. John wiped his mouth with his hand, looked at the blood, then turned his attention back to Penny's father, clenching his fists. He walked toward Mr. Miller, who seemed surprised at how little effect his blow had on John, and began to clumsily step back. But as soon as John was within striking distance, Jason's voice, tired but firm and decisive, stopped him. No, it's not worth it. He's not worth it. None of this is worth it." John looked at his suffering son, and the fury on his face gave way to an expression of quiet understanding. Brian walked over, put his hand on John's shoulder, and they began to make their way through the crowd and out of the church. The guests parted to make way for them, but Jason paused for a moment, scanning the now silent crowd. His gaze settled on Penny, whose face was contorted with pain and anticipation. He reached into his pocket and, in a fluid motion, tossed the ring in Penny's direction. It clanged loudly as it hit the tile, bounced twice, and stopped at her feet. "Goodbye, Penny," he said with bitterness in his voice before walking out of the hall like a condemned man and slowly made his way away. Jason sat hunched over in front of the coffee table in the small living room of his apartment, mindlessly staring out the window at the slow pace of the world outside as he munched on his last piece of cereal. Slowly standing up, he stretched and trudged across the living room, past the chair she used to read in, past the closet where her things were stored, and walked into the kitchen where she usually cooked. Throwing the empty bowl into the sink, he muttered, "1,000 days," looking at the empty bed littered with rumpled sheets, evidence of another night of loneliness, bad dreams, and sleepless thoughts. He took off his gym clothes, showered, and shaved before donning his usual dark, conservative suit, furiously tying his tie and turning away from his reflection in the mirror. He left the lonely apartment, heading to work. 1,000 damn days, he said aloud as he walked through the garage to his car, remembering another, much more painful path after he left the church that day. He was barely able to walk to the car, almost stumbling with the help of his father and Brian. The drive home was barely bearable. His father insisted on driving, speaking to him in the most soothing tone a gruff, stern man could muster, trying to convince Jason that life would go on and that things would get better in time. His father stayed with him for a week as Jason gradually came to his senses, first almost catatonic, then muttering incoherently, and finally falling into a low-grade depression. 1,000 days, and this is still the best part of my day, he sighed as he pulled into the Prairie Tower garage, mindlessly taking the elevator to the 42nd floor. He walked into his corner office, nodding to the janitors, the only people on the floor at this time of the morning, before sitting down at his desk and turning on the computer. This office was a sanctuary for him, a secluded corner where the intellectual attraction of numbers, graphs, and models could captivate his mind and repress the memories that tormented him. Memories of romantic kisses, tender nights of love, and hand-in-hand walks in the park. Painful because of memories of betrayal, tearful confessions, and the way the wedding ring clinked on the tiles and stopped at the hem of the wedding dress. At the urging of his friends, he tried several dates over those 3 years, a total of 5 dates with 5 different women. All of the dates had been awkward, with forced smiles and occasional awkward conversation, and none of them had gone well enough to warrant a second try. They all ended quite early, without even a kiss on the cheek. After the 5th date, about 6 months ago, Jason realized that he was not yet ready to communicate with women in general, let alone pursue romantic relationships, and again plunged into his voluntary isolation. And so he sat in his refuge, in the office, the only place where he felt comfortable, where the usefulness of work replaced human communication for him. Here, among his models and graphs, he could temporarily forget about the pain and dangers associated with relationships. However, every day ended, and he had to return home to his cold, empty apartment. He gradually began to understand that it was impossible to live the life of a hermit in high-tech forever, and that even he needed some kind of minimal social activity. So, that evening, he decided to do something new and try going to the party that Brian had insistently invited him to, showing an enthusiasm bordering on coercion. Leaning back in his office chair with his hands behind his head, Jason contemplated the discomfort he was about to experience that evening and briefly considered calling it off. But pursing his lips and shaking his head slightly, he looked determined, stood up, and took the car keys. The house was large, almost a mansion, standing on a street full of other similar houses. There were cars everywhere, filling the driveway, parked on both sides of the street, and even 2 cars parked neatly on the lawn. Jason slowly parked his car in a small space a block away and texted Brian that he had arrived. Moving slowly between the parked cars, by the time he reached the door, Brian had already stepped out to greet him, smiling widely and shifting nervously from foot to foot as Jason walked closer, as if afraid Jason might turn around and leave. Brian immediately put his arm around Jason's shoulders and quickly pushed him into the house. Despite its size, the house was full of people walking around, laughing, watching baseball, playing volleyball in the backyard, eating barbecue, and drinking beer. Brian took Jason from room to room, introducing him to old friends and new acquaintances at a breakneck pace. The men greeted him with loud cheers and slaps on the back, the women with flirtatious smiles and small talk. To his surprise, Jason was enjoying the party, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something like confidence around women. After about an hour of wandering around the house and trying out different treats and activities, Jason and Brian settled down in the game room for a rowdy match of pool. When Brian left to get a couple of beers, Jason felt comfortable enough to wander around on his own for a bit and eventually walked into the media room, where he met Buddy Johnson, a pleasant, chubby former classmate who seemed to have taken a seat next to the chips and salsa table. Buddy smiled warmly at Jason. "Hello, Jason. I haven't seen you for a long time. What's up, Buddy? Do you want some chips? There's also barbecue outside." No, I'm fine for now," Jason smiled in response and nodded toward the large TV, which was showing an advertisement. "What are you watching?" Buddy chewed a piece of food and then replied, Yeah, we just watched the Cubs lose in extra innings." He rolled his eyes in annoyance before continuing. "But now there's a movie on. When it's over, I think they'll connect the Xbox." Looks like it's ending now, so come soon if you want to play. Jason nodded at Buddy's words and calmly stood behind the couch where a group of people were sitting. As the movie continued, he recognized the scene, bit his lip, and began rubbing his hands together, becoming increasingly tense as he realized what kind of movie it was. It was the finale of The Graduate, and he watched as Dustin Hoffman's character, Benjamin Braddock, abandoned his car, running out of gas, and raced to the wedding on foot. Jason swallowed hard twice and began to breathe rapidly through his nose, watching as Braddock knocked on the glass and shouted, "Elaine," to get her attention. He then turned white as a sheet when Elaine saw Braddock and, noticing him, made a decision that caused complete chaos, suddenly leaving her wedding and running away with Braddock on the bus, leaving her fiancé behind. The informal audience, which consisted not only of those on the couch, but also several couples sitting on the floor, was clearly delighted by the scene. Two men who had drunk too much started shouting Elaine. As the scene played out on the screen, the others laughed and giggled. Jason, however, felt as if he was suddenly sick. He leaned over, placing his hands on his knees, as if he was about to pass out or start throwing up. One of the women passing by to take a snack delicately placed her hand on his back and carefully asked, "Are you okay?" Jason, embarrassed, quickly straightened up and looked around the room, full of people who were watching with such pleasure, as a woman left her groom at the altar for someone who apparently seemed better to her. He looked at the woman, a small olive-skinned Latina with a worried, uncertain smile, shook his head, and without saying a word, rushed to the exit. Brian approached Jason's apartment door with hesitation and stood in front of it for at least a minute before raising his hand to knock. When nothing happened, he knocked a second time, louder and more insistent. This time, there were footsteps, and then the door opened, revealing a tired and disheveled Jason, dressed in gym shorts and an old t-shirt. "Oh, hello, Brian. What do you need?" he asked expressionlessly, opening the door wider and inviting him in before slowly walking back into the living room. Brian hesitated for a moment, then followed him, turning to his back. "Look, dude, I'm sorry to barge in on you like this, but you're not answering your calls, and I wanted to talk. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry about how things turned out at the party last week, with this movie and in general. You didn't have to come to apologize. It's not your fault. Honestly, it's no one's fault at all. Yes, probably so, but I'm worried about you. I wanted to make sure you're okay, and apparently, I needed to talk to you and convey that." "What should I convey?" Jason interrupted him tiredly, sinking onto the sofa. Brian sat on the arm of the sofa, crossing his arms over his chest, looking thoughtfully at his gloomy friend before answering. "It's time for you to move on, Jason. Yes, you went through a difficult moment, but you must get out of this state and start living." "Oh, damn, Brian. It's easy to give such advice, but I was betrayed by the person I trusted most in my life. This is the most painful and humiliating thing I have ever experienced, and it was all because of the woman I loved. How do you even imagine moving on after this? Do you have any idea what this is like?" Brian raised both hands, as if trying to stop Jason's flow of pain with a simple gesture. Just stop, Jason. Stop it right now. You're right. I've never felt anything like the emotional blow Penny gave you. I understand that. But as a friend, I'm telling you that you can get through this if you want to, but it will take effort and a little courage. Jason snorted with disdain. "So now I'm a coward because they bullied me? Is that what you mean?" Brian sighed in irritation. "Stop it. That's not what I mean. I'm just saying that how your life turns out in the future ultimately depends only on you. You can remain isolated and alone, locked in this apartment like the character from Great Expectations. Or you can at least try to start something new." Jason sat up straight, gritting his teeth with suppressed rage, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Then, as if exhausted by his own emotions, he sank back into the couch. "Damn, Brian. I don't even know where to start. I can't figure out what to do." Brian grinned and pulled a folded piece of paper out of his pocket. "Well, Jason, I just have a solution for you." He unfolded the paper and plopped it onto Jason's knee. Jason took the piece of paper with suspicion and began to study it, frowning. Brian, it's just a list of girls. A list of girls who would be happy to go on a date with you. Names and numbers. All the information you need. All you have to do is call. I've already tried this. It didn't work. Well, then we need to try better. I'm not sure I can... I thought you would say that." Brian took out his phone and scrolled through several screens. "Listen, I was told to read this to you if you resist. So listen carefully." Brian pressed a button on the phone, and the room was filled with John Bright's deep but decisive voice. "Jason, no one knows better than me what the hell you had to go through with this wedding, and I understand why you were disappointed in life, especially in women. I understand. But honestly, son, it's time to take life into your own hands and start living again. I've seen you do amazing things, and now I ask, maybe even insist, that you do one more amazing thing. I want you to leave all this crap behind and start enjoying life." This grinning Brian gave me a list of girls who he says are top-notch. Now, I'm not sure Brian has more than 3 working brain cells in his head, but in this case, and in this case only, I suggest you do as he says. You don't need to throw yourself into the deep end. Just meet girls, have fun, forget your past, and leave it where it belongs, behind you. You have too much potential to live in a voluntary prison. Jason sat on the couch with his arms crossed over his chest, slowly rocking back and forth, staring into space, and looking at the list he had placed on the coffee table in front of him. "Well?" Brian asked after a few moments of awkward silence. Jason looked at him, blinking as if he had just woken up from a bright light. Brian sighed heavily. "Are you going to pull yourself together and invite one of these girls to somehow improve your life, or yes?" Jason suddenly interrupted him sharply. "Or will you continue this slow social suicide?" Brian froze, looking at his friend in surprise. "Wait, what did you say?" "Yes. Did you seriously say you would call one of these girls? Is that what you said?" "Yes, that's what I said." Jason's voice suddenly filled with determination. "My father is right. You are right. I need my life back. I have to move forward." Brian, rocking in his chair in surprise, opened his arms as if inviting Jason into action. His eyebrows raised in an expression of still lingering surprise. "Well, okay then," he finally said, without any reasonable criteria for choosing who to start with. Jason chose the first girl on the list. The first girl was the roommate of one of the girls Brian was dating. She moved like a ballerina, tall, slender, and graceful, and her shiny, straight brown hair fell over her shoulders like a silk cape. She was 26 years old, worked as a buyer at a local clothing store, and was fond of tennis. They went to dinner at an Italian restaurant and then to a show. The girl was polite and cheerful, but the conversation was strained and became increasingly painful and stilted as the evening went on. As soon as the performance ended, Jason took her home, which she seemed happy about. The evening ended with a dry kiss on the cheek and an apology. Jason spent the night tossing and turning in bed, worrying about the evening. He clenched his teeth and muttered curses, arguing with himself about the futility of communication. But the next morning, with grim determination, he took the list and called the second girl. The second girl was short and cheerful, a pale-skinned, freckled, red-haired girl who could hold a conversation with anyone. She worked as a veterinarian's assistant and loved dancing and skating. They went to a diner and then to a dance club, ending the evening at a lakeside cafe with a cup of coffee. The evening with this girl went smoothly for Jason. The conversation flowed naturally, albeit a little chaotically. They discussed everything from the state of the space program to comparing the merits of Labrador retrievers to snowboarding clothing styles. They seemed to talk about everything except their personal romantic stories, and Jason later realized that this was probably a direct instruction from Brian. Over the next 2 months, Jason met with her 4 more times. They went to the theater for a ballet, saw a movie, danced again, and had a picnic in the park. He enjoyed spending time with her, and she also enjoyed his company, but there was no spark between them. So, Jason carefully let the relationship fade away. He no longer asked her out, limiting himself to occasional calls and texts. The third girl was a freedom-loving person. She had light brown hair worn in a ponytail, laughing brown eyes, and tan skin. She was a little overweight, but her charm and cheerfulness attracted attention. She worked as a research assistant in the physics department at Northwestern University, but on weekends and sometimes during the week, she threw parties. She loved motorcycles, loud music, and smoking. Jason invited her to a rock concert. When they returned, she offered to come over and see him, and Jason, after some hesitation, accepted the invitation. Her apartment was filled with the sounds of the Grateful Dead and the thick, Swedish, acrid smell of smoke. The roommate, tall and thin, was sitting in the kitchen rolling out brownie dough. Jason settled down on the couch and tried to act casual until he found an excuse to leave. He drove home. Arriving home, he immediately took off his clothes and threw them in the washing machine, then took a shower, wondering if he could test positive for illegal substances from secondhand smoke. The next day, He called the fourth girl. She was something of a Marilyn Monroe copy. Short, curly platinum hair, a curvaceous figure, and bright red lipstick. She worked as a saleswoman, lived with her parents, and seemed to have no special interests. Jason, who by then had regained the ability to communicate normally with women, tried to carry on a conversation over dinner, but it was tedious and boring. When he brought her home, she invited him over for drinks, making it clear that her parents would be away for the week. Her curvy figure and deep cleavage made the offer tempting, but Jason couldn't bring himself to start a relationship, intimate or otherwise, with such an empty-headed girl. So, he politely declined and drove home, where he ended the evening with a bottle of baby oil in front of the computer. Girls number 5, 6, and 7 were beautiful, sociable, cheerful, but did not stand out in anything special. He enjoyed spending time with them. They had fun conversations, laughed, and even had light, intimate moments. He went on second, third, and even fourth dates with them, but never felt anything other than a slight pleasant satisfaction. Jason began to worry that the deep feelings he had for Penny would never return. He began to entertain the idea that he might have to find someone he could feel comfortable with and gradually fall in love with, and that such a passionate, deep love as he had for Penny would never happen again. But that was before meeting girl number 8. Gail and Rawson was a 28-year-old University of Illinois graduate with a degree in marketing and a good job in the advertising department of a downtown department store. By most accounts, she was at least pretty, if not beautiful. Shoulder-length ash blonde hair framed a heart-shaped face. Her skin was lightly freckled, and she had a soft, comfortable figure. She was the only girl on the list that Jason and Brian had never dated. Her brother worked with Brian, and after hearing about Jason, he suggested his sister. Brian looked at her photo and added her to the list. When Jason first called her, Gail was wary and rather hesitant, surprised that he had called her at all. She vaguely remembered her brother talking about Jason a few months ago, but now that she was actually asked to meet a stranger, she was overcome with shyness and politely declined. Jason, who was slightly relieved that he wouldn't have to try to impress a stranger, took it in stride. But a couple of days later, Gail called back and apologized for her refusal, explaining that her initial reaction was due to uncertainty and that after talking with her brother, she had changed her mind. They talked on the phone for a bit, joked about how blind dates could be awkward, and agreed to have a leisurely lunch later in the week. They met at a small cafe in the city center that served soups and salads. The conversation was tense at the beginning. They exchanged standard introductory comments, talked about work and education, shared general information about their families, and superficially discussed preferences in soups and stews. Gradually, the conversation became easier and more relaxed. They began to share stories, discuss hobbies, and laugh. When they finished lunch, Jason handed over his credit card. He was surprised to notice that he was already half an hour late for work. He quickly paid the bill and walked Gail to the curb, where he hailed a taxi for her before heading back to work himself. In his office, Jason mindlessly busied himself with his afternoon tasks while remembering his lunch with Gail. As part of his plan not to appear needy or too anxious around the girls he was getting along with, Jason decided to wait a couple of days before contacting Gail again. However, after a few hours, he decided that he wanted to invite her to a play that was coming to town in a couple of weeks. He decided to call her the next day to give her the opportunity to decline. By the end of the day, he adjusted his plan and decided to call her that evening to invite her to dinner on the weekend. He ended up calling her before he left work, asking her out for the next evening. She agreed. They had dinner at an expensive steakhouse, planning to go to the movies afterward, but they were so caught up in conversation during dinner that they missed the start of the show. So, they lingered at the table, sharing dessert for over an hour, and continuing to talk long after the waiter brought the check. Eventually, he began to give them subtle hints, and then more insistently suggested that they continue their conversation elsewhere because the restaurant needed the table. Gail was confused, but Jason just laughed and suggested moving their date to a nearby bar instead of calling it a night. They continued their conversation at the bar, discussing anything and everything, from clothing preferences to favorite sports teams to travel dreams. They talked seriously about important things, lightly about funny things, and with great interest, sharing little facts about themselves. Somehow, the conversation turned to the topic of the excessive lifestyles of the rich and famous. Jason expressed his views on how money and fame likely exacerbate problems associated with poor life choices, citing several famous people as examples. When he mentioned Lindsay Lohan, Gail snorted and rolled her eyes in obvious disgust. God, Lindsay Lohan. How I hate her, she said, almost spitting out the words. Jason raised his eyebrows and tilted his head in confusion. Why does she annoy you so much? I understand that she lost control of herself, and she punished herself. But how is she different from others? Gail took a deep breath, bit her lip, and looked up at the ceiling before looking back at Jason. It's not about her addiction or anything like that. Actually, I don't care about it. The problem is that she was in a Disney movie that I can't stand, and I can't help but feel like she's personally to blame for it. Wait, you hate her because she was in a movie you didn't like? Gail closed her eyes and wrinkled her nose, as if the conversation had taken an unpleasant turn. No, well, not really. I mean, I really hated that movie. Jason tilted his head to the side, looking at Gail thoughtfully. Seriously? You'll have to explain this to me. I don't understand how a movie, especially a Disney one, can be so bad. Gail exhaled a long, controlled sigh and leaned forward, resting her cheek on her hand with her elbow on the table. You're forcing me to talk about it, aren't you? She smiled. Yes, Jason laughed. I think so. Gail took another deep breath and let it out slowly before speaking again. Okay, this is a remake of The Parent Trap. The original was with Haley Mills. Do you know the story? Yes, I think so. Two twin girls find out they're sisters and try to get mom and dad back together again, right? Well, yes, but the terrible things they did to that girl who was going to marry their father. Gail raised her eyebrows and Jason leaned in, intrigued. She leaned back, biting her lip lightly as if contemplating what to say next. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair and gave Jason an embarrassed smile. Look, everyone loved this movie because they wanted their parents to get back together, and no one liked this platinum blonde girl he was engaged to. So everything they did to her was considered funny. But the thing is this, I truly understand this girl. She just fell in love with this guy and wanted to marry him. And these girls were plotting terrible things against her to ruin her relationship with their father. I understand that the movie made her out to be a gold digger, but she's just wait. Why do you care? You really don't understand, do you? Gail's face expressed genuine surprise, and Jason realized that he was missing something important from her past. He shrugged, shook his head, and smiled, answering her question gently. No, I have no idea. Gail pursed her lips and ran a hand through her hair, stopping to rub the back of her neck before continuing. I guess I thought you knew about my history. I thought maybe Brian or my brother told you, and that they were trying to set me up with a nice guy. Honestly, Gail, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, at least you know about my relationship with Trevor, right? I've mentioned him a couple of times. Well, yes, Jason nodded. I thought things were pretty serious with you. Well, yes, it was. Gail hesitated, clearing her throat. In general, he was older than me. He was a little over 40, an architect, divorced, and we started dating. Things got pretty serious, and we started talking about marriage. But he had a daughter, Amy. She was 14 at the time and hated me. Why? She really wanted her parents to be together again. The divorce was difficult for her, and I think she never came to terms with the fact that it was over. And when things got serious with Trevor, she decided that if she ruined our relationship, then her parents still had a chance. Was she hysterical? Gail took a sip of her drink and shook her head, but the small, embarrassed smile remained on her face. No, she set a parent trap for me. Mischief. She did everything to make me look bad, or like a naughty. Jason looked at Gail curiously. Oh, you want me to tell you about the pranks, right? Jason smiled widely and nodded his head. Gail snorted and shook her head as if she couldn't believe she was going to do this. Okay, buckle up. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly before beginning her story. The first prank I know of was the night I was going to meet his business partners. I lost my favorite perfume, and Amy ran out with it as we were leaving the house. I didn't have time to apply it until we arrived at the restaurant, but it turned out that she had added something terrible to it, like raw sewage, into my perfume. I didn't even realize I smelled like that until Trevor sniffed my neck and almost choked. When we entered the restaurant, I wanted to go home and clean myself up, but it was too late. So I went to the toilet and tried to clean myself up as best I could, but I still thought I smelled terrible. Every time someone approached me, their faces twisted like they had just drunk sour milk. Oh my God, that's terrible, Jason said, barely containing his laughter. Yeah, I really felt sympathy, she said with a sarcastic smile. But that was just the beginning. Before our next big date, she washed my underwear in the same crap and put some of that stuff in my intimate gel. She also replaced my vitamins with garlic capsules, so my breath was absolutely terrible, as you can imagine. I told Trevor what she did, but he didn't say much. To be honest, I started to think that he just decided that I smelled bad. Jason leaned forward and defiantly inhaled the air as if sniffing. Well, now I don't smell anything, but maybe I'll go outside and smell again. Maybe the smells here are hiding something. Very funny, she said with a fake grimace, which quickly turned into a smile before she continued. But then there was another incident when she somehow managed to put fly pheromones on me before a picnic with friends. Soon after that, I was completely covered with these small black creatures. Can you imagine the impression I made on everyone as the fly lady? Jason looked at her, his eyes wide. I was furious and asked Trevor to talk to Amy, but he just ignored it. And this ruined your relationship? Jason asked, almost but not quite. This really stressed me out and made me paranoid, and of course, it became impossible to trust Amy or try to befriend her. This made everything more complicated. But the last straw came when we had a big dinner and invited his parents and several important clients. She mixed some kind of sedative into my wine. I think it was something like Ativan. By the middle of dinner, I was already beginning to slur my words and could barely keep my eyes open. By the end of dinner, I had completely passed out, burying my face in a plate of chicken. Amy somehow managed to wet the back of my dress. So when Trevor and the other guy carried me into the bedroom, everyone thought I had wet myself. You're kidding me, Jason said in disbelief. Not at all. This is the honest truth. And after that, we quarreled. He said he was ashamed of my behavior, and when I blamed Amy, he only got angrier. I couldn't stand his lack of support anymore, and he couldn't handle conflict. So, we broke up. Gail paused and then laughed. Just like Disney, right? Well, maybe in some sick, twisted Disney movie, Jason said. Well, that's my sad story, she said, tilting her head to the side and smiling at it. Curiously, what's your story? She asked softly. Jason leaned back in his chair. Well, mine isn't from Disney, but it's more like Runaway Bride, I think. Ah, did she change her mind at the last moment? Gail suggested. No, she was more interested in her old boyfriend right before the wedding. Gail asked, raising her eyebrows in surprise. No, right at the wedding. I was already in my tuxedo, ready for the ceremony, humming the wedding march, and then she comes in her wedding dress, and says that everything is canceled. She says that she loves someone else and that we won't get married. God, this is terrible, Gail said. Yes, it was hard. Jason smiled a little wider. I told you about my father, how tough he is. Well, he almost caused a scandal in the church, called her out, shouted at the guests. It was complete chaos. What did you do? Gail asked with interest. What could I do? I just walked out like a zombie, he laughed briefly. I was shocked, to be honest. A real nightmare. I think this is the first time I've laughed while telling this story, or even just remembering it now. It all seems so far away, almost as if it happened to someone else. Well, time heals. Time? Yes, of course it helps, but I think the big difference is you. They left the bar holding hands and walked quietly down the sidewalk to the restaurant parking lot and to the car. Jason opened the door and helped Gail sit down. Once behind the wheel, he fumbled awkwardly with the seatbelt and the ignition before turning to Gail with noticeable nervousness. I don't want to seem too pushy, but I really enjoyed spending time with you tonight, and I thought maybe you'd like to spend some more time together. Not much is open now, but we could go to my apartment. It's not far from here. Gail looked away and stared out the window without saying anything. Jason's invitation hung in the air, creating a tense silence. After a few moments, Jason awkwardly broke the silence. Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you in an awkward position. We haven't really known each other for long. I understand. So forgive me if, as he spoke, Gail turned to him and looked intently into his eyes with a direct, searching gaze. Yes, she said simply, interrupting his apology. Yes, we haven't known each other for long. And yes, I want to go with you. 15 minutes later, Jason stood in front of his apartment door and opened it wide for Gail, awkwardly saying, "There you go," wishing he could say something wittier. Gail walked slowly into the apartment and stood in the hallway, allowing Jason to take her coat as she passed him. "Come on in, sit on the sofa if you want," he said. She took 2 small steps forward and froze, slowly looking around the apartment as if unsure of herself. Her gaze moved from the kitchen to the living room, then down the hallway and finally back to Jason, who was nervously watching her reaction. She looked at him with the same gaze she had given him in the car when she agreed to come with him. "Jason," she said quietly but clearly, "just take me to the bedroom." Jason swallowed twice, took a deep breath, and then nodded. He raised his hand slightly, offering it to Gail, who took it. He led her down the hallway to the bedroom. Jason turned to her and gently ran his fingers along the back of her head. Then he slowly leaned towards her, and Gail raised her face. Her cheeks flushed, her lips parted, and her eyes closed. He kissed her lightly. After a few minutes, Gail pulled away, placed her hands on his chest. Then they make a love, breathing heavily as if after running. She moved her hands to his waist. Jason slowly reached out to her, his touch careful and gentle, as if he were touching something priceless. He leaned down and kissed her lightly. They enjoyed the closeness, feeling how each moment connected them even stronger. Her breathing became more rapid. His gaze was filled with tenderness as he stopped for a moment to simply admire her figure. Every gesture was imbued with care and love, and they continued to explore each other slowly, enjoying every second spent together. Their movements were both calm and confident, filled with a sense of unity. Jason took his time, enjoying her presence next to him, feeling her breath merge with his. They were simply there, completely immersed in the moment, letting their feelings speak for them. Everything that happened between them was natural and warm, not requiring words. When Jason held her close, they felt complete harmony, peace, and comfort, which they shared without a trace of doubt. The second time was long. They fell asleep with their legs and arms intertwined. Somewhere in the middle of the night, Jason woke up and realized, for the first time in years, that he was not alone in his bed. His eyes opened slightly, and in the dim light falling from the corridor, he saw Gail's smiling face. She lay on her side, resting her head on her left hand, and with her right hand, she lazily drew chaotic patterns on his chest. "Hello," she said quietly. "Hello to you too. Can't sleep?" "No, I woke up a little while ago and thought about it." "What were you thinking?" Jason asked gently, stroking her smooth back with his hand. "About that." She paused, looking Jason straight in the eyes, lightly biting her lower lip. "What exactly?" he asked softly. "I'm not sure it's worth saying. A girl shouldn't always reveal her plans," she said with a mysterious smile. "Plans? What are your plans?" Jason tried to understand her hints. An even more mysterious smile flashed across her lips, and she began to shake her head, as if physically trying to decide whether to speak further. The smile faded, giving way to a look of determination as she looked Jason straight in the eye. "I'm going to make you mine," she said, as if stating an indisputable fact, a truth that could not be denied or disputed. Jason opened his mouth, raising his eyebrows in surprise, and Gail, holding her breath, waited for his answer with a slight smile. "You're on the right track," he answered quietly, not taking his eyes off her face. And this right start quickly turned into a whirlwind romance that was nothing short of sensational. Everything, from the places they went to the vacations they took together, to their nightlife, seemed completely natural and pleasant, as if every moment filled their lives with newness and excitement. Their romance was so strong and intense that it dispelled any doubts or worries that might have slowed the progress of their relationship, and they soon became engaged, deciding to marry as soon as everything could be arranged. Like everything else in their relationship, preparations for the wedding went smoothly, without any problems or conflicts. Any worries or nervousness Jason might have had remained in the part of his mind where impossible things are stored. Everything seemed perfect. That was until Gail accidentally revealed that Trevor had contacted her and expressed a desire to attend not only the wedding, but also some of the events leading up to the celebration, and that she had invited him. Jason felt a lump in his chest when she said this, but trying to appear reasonable and confident, he accepted the information as something normal. He hoped that Gail was just trying to be polite, trying to appear above it, and allowing an old acquaintance to attend an important event. However, within minutes of Trevor's arrival, Jason realized that Trevor saw himself as more than just Gail's friend. Trevor didn't try very hard to hide his feelings. From the beginning, he made sure to take Gail aside for private conversations, where he could smile endlessly and lean closer to whisper to her, not paying attention to the others. When he couldn't take her away, he was always there, constantly touching her, either putting his hand on her shoulder or putting his arm around her waist, and then, with a smug smile, glancing in Jason's direction, as if Gail still belonged to him. The most frustrating thing was that although Gail sometimes tried to push him away, she never asked him to leave or stop his behavior, nor did she speak out as harshly as the situation required. And so, less than 10 months after they first met, Jason found himself at the rehearsal for his second wedding with his second bride in his life. For the first time, Jason experienced the feeling of impending disaster again, because at this dinner, everything seemed worse, much worse than he could have imagined. Trevor sat a few places away from him, confident and tanned, with a bright, dazzling smile. He was cheerfully talking with several ladies who listened to him attentively. He was the epitome of charm and tact, the center of attention in the room, especially to Gail, who could hardly take her eyes off him for even a few seconds. With every furtive glance, with every hidden smile, the lump that Gail had planted in Jason's chest grew, turning into an emotional tumor that consumed his mood and destroyed his composure. He barely touched the food on his plate, aimlessly pushing it around, barely maintaining a conversation with the guests, who seemed to notice his discomfort better than Gail. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he pushed the plate away and cursed quietly, resting his elbows on the table and rubbing his temples with his knuckles. Gail finally paid attention to him. "God, are you okay? You look a little unwell," she said. Jason looked at her with a blank, almost menacing stare, pondering what to say. Then, he leaned over and whispered in her ear with such anger in his voice that it hit her like a blow. "Damn it, Gail. If you're going to betray me, at least do it with a knife." Gail's eyes widened in shock and fear. What are you saying, Jason? What's wrong with you? What are you talking about?" Jason let out a short, amused laugh. "Oh, come on, Gail. I've been through this before." He nodded toward Trevor. "You're basically inviting your ex to our rehearsal without asking me. You suddenly started keeping secrets, taking calls in private, clearly planning something. And now, at dinner, you can't take your eyes off him, smiling to yourself, probably thinking about some kind of personal fantasy. And you're all on edge. I know how it ends. I've been through it before. Maybe we should move him here and switch places. Will that make it easier for you?" Gail began shaking her head furiously, leaning closer to Jason as if trying not to be heard. "Oh no, Jason. You don't understand. I didn't invite him. He invited himself. He said that he wanted to be present, that he wanted to see me, and I had my own plan. That's why I kept it a secret. I knew that you would be angry, so I just didn't tell you." "Angry about what? Because of some last date? What could my fiancée do with her ex before the wedding that shouldn't bother me?" "No, Jason. No. Just stop." Her voice suddenly became quiet and urgent, the panic she had felt a moment ago replaced by determination. "It's not what you think." Jason raised his eyebrows, waiting for an explanation. Gail took a deep, slow breath through her nose before speaking again. "Look, if you just wait a minute, just a couple of minutes, I think you'll understand." At that moment, just a few chairs down, one of the women Trevor had been charming suddenly asked loudly, "What's that on your teeth? Is this juice?" Before she could even turn around to realize what was going on, Gail smiled broadly at Jason and raised her eyebrows. "Or perhaps you won't have to wait," she said calmly. Jason's face softened from anger to confusion, and he turned toward the source of the noise. What he saw seemed so strange to him that, for a moment, he couldn't believe his eyes. Trevor was still sitting, still smiling, but now with a concerned expression on his face, raising his hand to his mouth. His blindingly white teeth had somehow turned dark blue, as had his lips. A drop of blue was running down the right side of his chin. "What the hell is this?" Jason muttered, eyes wide. What did you do?" "Oh, this is not the end yet," Gail answered calmly, looking back at what was happening. "We're not finished yet." Jason watched in confusion as Trevor, barely holding back a smile, tried to wipe his mouth with a napkin, dipping it into a glass of water. But when he took another sip of water, the liquid began to flow uncontrollably from the corners of his mouth, spreading the blue dye even further onto his neck and white shirt. Trevor threw the glass on the table and began touching his mouth and hair in a disoriented manner, spreading marks all over his face and head. Soon, his perfect hair turned into a disheveled shock, and the blue dye spread even more onto his clothes. Trevor threw the glass onto the table, his annoyed face quickly giving way to an expression of growing concern. It seemed his head was now completely filled with thoughts about what was happening to his appearance. Without thinking, he rubbed his lips with his hand, thereby spreading the blue paint even further along his chin. His perfectly styled hair soon turned into a disheveled tangle, with traces of blue dye stuck in it. Jason, spellbound, looked at what was happening to Trevor and could not understand how one person, in such a short span of time, could go from being a stately, self-confident man to a frightened clown. But the final moment may have been the most ridiculous. As Trevor tried to get up and run to the bathroom to somehow fix the disaster, his movements suddenly slowed, and he realized that his pants were stuck to the chair. In a panic, he grabbed a knife from the table and began desperately cutting the fabric to free himself. All of this happened amidst the growing laughter of the guests, who could no longer contain their amusement. Finally, Trevor, with difficulty, freed himself from the chair and, looking completely defeated, blue-faced and disheveled, hurried to the toilet under a hail of ridicule. Jason turned to Gail, who was watching the entire scene with an expression of calm complacency. "Oh my God, that was cruel," he said, not believing what he had just seen. "But to be honest, it's also incredibly funny." Gail raised her eyebrows with a sly smile. "Yes, it was cruel, but you must admit it was deserved. And I especially liked his reaction to the last part." Jason lowered his voice, moving closer to her. "What do you mean? That was your doing, right?" "Well, not exactly mine," she said with a faint smile, nodding toward the end of the table. Jason followed her gaze and saw his father sitting at the table, smiling cheerfully and raising his glass of wine and a toast when he noticed them looking at him. "Oh my God," Jason said, laughing. "Well, who did I get involved with?" "I don't know," Gail answered, batting her eyelashes coquettishly and hugging his arm. "But what do you think you got yourself into?" "To heaven," Jason answered quietly, looking at her with a smile. Penny parked the pickup under a tree in the shade, wiping sweat from her brow and cursing the broken air conditioner. Before getting out of the cab, she walked slowly down the cracked concrete path, overrun with weeds, toward the duplex door, passing a tiny lawn of dry brown grass and a faulty sprinkler that seemed to serve as a monument to summer's futility. Opening the screen door, she walked through the ajar front door into the living room. The fan, standing on a box next to the sofa, was working at full power, blowing air over the lying figure of her husband. Penny deliberately slammed the door loud enough to make Kenny stir and open his eyes. "Hi, honey," he said in a groggy, sleepy voice, rubbing his hand through his tousled hair. "What time is it?" Penny crossed her arms and looked around the cluttered living room. An empty pizza box and a half-eaten bowl of cereal sat on the coffee table. A video game console lay on the floor next to the couch, along with a pair of socks and several crumpled pieces of paper. Nearby, the TV was on, playing the video game intro over and over again, and country music was playing loudly from the kitchen. "It's 4:30, Penny said forcefully, then walked over to the fan, leaning over to feel the coolness on her face. "Did you go to an interview today?" Kenny sat up, stretching his arms lazily. "How could I go to an interview if you had a car?" Penny stood up straight again and crossed her arms over her chest, raising her eyebrows. "I don't know. You could search the internet, fill out some forms, and call a couple of places. It's been 7 months, and we're just holding out on our last breath. Have you done anything? Anything?" Kenny sucked in an irritated breath through his teeth. "Yes, I did something. I looked for vacancies on the internet, but it was crap. Maybe a temporary job won't kill you. Maybe it won't kill you to stop being boring," Penny retorted sharply. Her face instantly darkened, and she covered her mouth with her hands, blinking her eyes rapidly. Kenny's expression softened, and he immediately jumped up, walking over to Penny, hugging her and whispering in her ear. "Sorry, Penny. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. I just don't want to take some primitive job with a small salary." He pulled back a little and looked into her eyes. "Just trust me, honey. You know there's a new car dealership opening on the west side of town soon, and I have a position lined up there. Everything will be fine. Give me some time and space." Penny sniffled and nodded. "Okay, Kenny. Okay. I'm just starting to get nervous. My job in accounting pays peanuts and we have no savings. We really need a second income." "I know, Penny. I know. And I'll sort it out soon. Don't worry, honey. Don't worry." They exchanged small smiles, and Penny kissed his cheek before heading into the small alcove between the kitchen and living room, where there was a desk with a computer and a couple of filing cabinets. She sat down with a thump, moved the mouse to wake up the computer, shuffled the papers around a bit, and pulled out a credit card to pay a few bills. After a couple of minutes of data entry, she pushed the papers away and arched her back in a deep yawn before returning to the computer to check her browser history. With a feeling of simultaneous disappointment and relief, she noticed that the search results did indeed contain 1 page of vacancies, interspersed with sports sites and YouTube videos. She glanced at her husband, who was currently pulling a piece of cold pizza out of a box on the coffee table. "Do you want a piece?" he asked, handing her the second slice, which had already fallen. She shook her head. No, thanks. I was planning on going out with the girls today. Do you remember?" "Oh, yes, he said, nodding and chewing. "Hey, don't spend too much money," he added after swallowing the bite. "I won't," she replied, giving Kenny a warm half-smile. He responded with a wide grin before turning his attention back to the important task of finishing his pizza. She looked at her husband for a while and couldn't help but see in him a boy in the body of a grown man. With his dirty blonde hair, disheveled clothes, and the same enthusiastic greed with which he ate pizza, for a moment it seemed to her that this was the same guy she had met in high school more than 20 years ago. Absent-mindedly, she reached for the wooden box on the shelf above the table and felt the familiar opal pendant. Her fingers groped for the pendant, and she gazed at it for another minute while watching her husband. She then leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes with a dreamy, thoughtful smile on her face. But the smile quickly disappeared when she heard swearing. Slowly opening one eye, she saw Kenny unsuccessfully trying to control the game controller in front of the TV. Wrinkling her nose in slight disgust, she frowned for a moment before biting her lip. She looked back at the box, and with a slow, hesitant, guilty movement, she lifted a piece of cardboard covered with velvet and took out a beautiful gold ring with a dazzling, sparkling diamond. She held the ring in her palm, mulling something over to herself before slowly slipping it onto her finger, secretly admiring the way it sparkled under the ceiling light. Taking a quick glance into the living room, she returned to the computer and, sighing with a feeling of regret, began to quickly type on the keyboard. Once again, she brought up the images she had carefully saved for almost 10 years. Photos collected from social networks, corporate announcements, and news images of Jason. Jason surrounded by colleagues in blue suits in a promotion announcement photo. Jason and his beautiful wife splashing in the waves and relaxing on the beach during their honeymoon in Hawaii. A family photo in front of a beautiful house with his wife, his smiling father John, and an adorable baby with a sweet, crooked smile. Ideal home, ideal family, ideal life. The ringing of the phone brought Penny out of her thoughts, and she quickly grabbed the receiver, hearing the endlessly cheerful voice of Betsy Palmer on the other end. "Hey, how's the birthday girl doing? 2 days late? Are you ready for the bachelorette party?" Penny thought for a moment before answering, her voice sounding uncertain and distracted. "Yes, Betsy. I don't know. I was thinking, our budget is tight right now, and... Oh no, what are you talking about? This is your gift from all of us. You're not paying a penny, so no excuses, okay? We'll all be there. The whole gang, except Teresa, of course." "Wait, Teresa won't come? Why?" Betsy's enthusiasm waned a little. Looks like you don't know. She took a second job and can't come today. Tim is back in rehab. She needs to work harder to make ends meet, so... Oh, damn. I didn't even know." Betsy became cheerful again. "Yes, it's unpleasant, but it's okay. We'll arrange something else with her, and today we'll have a great time. And don't even think about being late. Otherwise, we'll miss the start of the movie." "A film?" "Yes, we were going to see a romantic comedy with Jennifer Lawrence. They say she's very sweet, but the show's at 7, so we need to have dinner in time." There was a pause as Penny bit her lip in thought before answering with reluctance and a hint of worry in her voice. Is this the only movie?" "Well, there's also a Tarantino Western, but nothing else worthwhile," Betsy said, deliberately drawing out the Tarantino Western and adding sarcastic contempt to her tone. Penny snorted before answering, her voice still quiet and uncertain. I don't know. I guess I'd prefer a Western." Betsy's voice became puzzled, and she laughed slightly mockingly. "Seriously? You're kidding, right? A Western? I didn't even know you liked them." Penny pursed her lips as she glanced at her husband, who was sitting cross-legged on the old carpet amidst the trash he had allowed to accumulate around him, completely engrossed in the video game, frantically manipulating the controller. Then she looked at the image on her screen of Jason and his perfect little family standing happily in front of their gorgeous home. Her voice was filled with a deep sense of melancholy and slight sentimentality, a tone filled with regret. "Betsy, it's not that I like Westerns," Penny managed with difficulty. "The thing is, I really, really hate romantic comedies." The latter part of your text seems to shift in tone and style. If it's meant to be part of a script, an announcement, or something else, here's a clearer version of the second part. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you. And go ahead and listen to the next story, because this one is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, Don't even think about it. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.